The chandeliers of Lady Pemberton's ballroom cast their golden light across silk gowns and polished floors, illuminating a scene that had repeated itself countless times throughout London's 1815 season. Gentlemen in evening dress circling like predators around young ladies adorned in their finest, mothers watching with calculating eyes, musicians playing waltzes that seemed to mock those left without partners. In the far corner, partially obscured by a potted fern and quite deliberately positioned beyond the notice of those who measured worth in beauty and breeding, sat Lady Beatrice Thornwood with a volume of Byron's poetry open upon her lap, her fingers tracing the verses as though they might transport her somewhere far from this glittering prison of judgment. She was accustomed to her station here among the wallflowers and forgotten daughters, accustomed to the way eyes slid past her unremarkable form without pause or interest, for she possessed none of the attributes society deemed essential for feminine success. Her hair, a mousy brown that refused all attempts at fashionable arrangement, framed a face marked by freckles that powder could not conceal, and features that were pleasant enough, but entirely forgettable by the exacting standards of the ton. She was unfashionably tall, her figure neither willowy nor voluptuous but simply ordinary, and her dowry, while respectable, was not sufficient to overcome these deficiencies in the marriage market's cruel arithmetic. Yet within her chest beat a heart that felt perhaps too deeply, and behind her unremarkable hazel eyes lived a mind sharp enough to dissect the absurdities of the world that dismissed her, a wit that she kept carefully contained for fear of making herself even less palatable to potential suitors who preferred their wives decorative and docile. She had learned to find solace in literature, in the worlds that opened between the covers of books, in poets who wrote of love and loss and beauty that transcended the merely physical. The strains of a quadrille floated across the ballroom, and she watched, as she had watched 100 times before, the couples moving through their paces with practiced grace, wondering what it might feel like to be chosen, to be seen, to be desired. It was then that she heard the voice, deep, cultured, edged with aristocratic arrogance, carrying from the nearby alcove where gentlemen gathered to discuss horses and politics and the relative merits of the season's debutantes. The Duke of Ashford, resplendent in evening attire that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding height, stood among his companions like a god among mortals, his handsome features arranged in an expression of bored superiority that came naturally to those born to his station. She had observed him throughout the season, as one might observe a comet or eclipse something brilliant and distant and entirely beyond reach. And she had indulged in no foolish fantasies about attracting his notice, for she understood precisely where she stood in society's hierarchy. But now his voice reached her with perfect, devastating clarity as he responded to some question about potential matches. Lady Beatrice Thornwood? Good God, no. The girl is plain and utterly unmarriageable, a tragedy of wasted breeding. One would need to be desperate indeed to consider such a union. The laughter that followed his pronouncement struck her like physical blows, each chuckle from his companions another nail in the coffin of her dignity. The poetry volume slipped from her numb fingers, and she felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been fragile but hopeful, something that had believed, perhaps, one day, someone might see past her ordinary exterior to the person within. She did not cry, she had too much pride for that, but she stood with careful precision, retrieved her book, and walked from the ballroom with her head high and her heart shattered, knowing with absolute certainty that she would never again subject herself to this particular form of torture, that she would withdraw entirely from a society that had made its judgment clear through the careless cruelty of a duke who would never remember this moment or the devastation it wrought. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The weeks that followed her departure from London passed in a blur of rain and restless nights, and Beatrice found herself at last in the familiar embrace of Thornwood Hall, her family's country estate in Derbyshire, where the rolling hills and ancient forests offered sanctuary from the cruelty of society's ballrooms and the echoing memory of words that had carved themselves into her very soul. She had told her parents only that the season had exhausted her, that she required rest and country air, and they had accepted this explanation with the gentle concern of those who loved her, but had never quite understood the depths of her interior world. the vast landscapes of thought and feeling that existed behind her unremarkable exterior. Here, surrounded by the books that lined the library walls and the gardens her mother had planted years ago, Beatrice began the slow work of transforming her pain into something resembling purpose, refusing to allow the Duke of Ashford's dismissal to define the boundaries of her existence. She rose each morning with the sun and walked through the village, where the cottagers greeted her with genuine warmth that had nothing to do with her appearance or marriageability, where her worth was measured in kindness rather than beauty, in useful action rather than decorative presence. The village school, a modest building that served the children of farmers and tradesmen, became her particular project, and she spent her afternoons teaching them their letters and numbers, watching their faces light with the same wonder she had felt when books first opened their worlds to her, thinking that perhaps this was a better legacy than any society marriage could offer these young minds she helped nurture. These futures she helped shape through the gift of literacy and learning. When fever swept through the village as autumn approached, she moved among the sick with the physician, carrying broth and clean linens, sitting through long nights with those who had no one else, her hands gentle on fevered brows, her voice soft with prayers and comfort, and she discovered that being needed was its own form of beauty, that being useful carried its own dignity that no ballroom judgment could diminish. Meanwhile, in London, the Duke of Ashford continued through his days in the thoughtless manner of those accustomed to privilege, his casual cruelty already forgotten among the countless other pronouncements and opinions he delivered with the certainty of one who had never questioned his right to judge, his nights filled with cards and drink and the admiration of those who sought favour with a duke, his words about Lady Beatrice Thornwood no more significant to him than his choice of cravat or his opinion on the weather. Yet at Thornwood Hall, Beatrice's brother Edmund arrived with the fury of a storm, his normally pleasant features hardened with rage as he demanded to know the full details of what had driven his beloved sister from London, and when she finally confessed the whole of it, the overheard conversation, the Duke's pronouncement, the laughter of his companions, Edmund's hand went to his sword with an instinct born of love and protective fury. But Beatrice stayed him with a touch to his arm and eyes that pleaded for peace, telling him that dueling the Duke of Ashford would solve nothing, would only create scandal and confirm society's view that she was indeed unmarriageable, a woman whose family must defend her with violence because her own merits could not speak for themselves. Edmund yielded to her wishes, though his jaw remained tight with suppressed anger, though he swore privately that should he ever encounter Ashford in circumstances that permitted retribution, he would ensure the Duke understood the cost of wounding those who deserved only kindness, and he watched his sister retreat further into her books and charitable works, recognizing the particular loneliness of one who had hoped for love and found only dismissal, wondering if she would ever trust again enough to open her guarded heart. Autumn arrived with its palette of amber and crimson, transforming the Derbyshire countryside into something resembling the illuminated manuscripts Beatrice had studied in her father's library, and with the changing season came Lord Sebastian Hartley, a widower of some 35 years, whose reputation as a poet and scholar had reached even into the quiet corners of country society, where Beatrice had taken refuge from the cruelties of the fashionable world. He had come to the region seeking inspiration for a collection of verses about England's rural landscapes, staying with distant cousins whose estate bordered Thornwood lands, and it was on a crisp October morning, when the air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, that he first encountered Lady Beatrice in the village schoolhouse, where she sat surrounded by a dozen children of varying ages, her voice animated as she guided them through their letters with a patience and enthusiasm that seemed to illuminate her features from within. Sebastian paused in the doorway, arrested not by beauty in the conventional sense, but by something far more compelling, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes as she explained a difficult concept, the genuine warmth of her smile when a struggling student finally grasped his lesson, the graceful economy of her movements as she moved between the rough wooden benches, and he found himself thinking that here was a woman society had somehow overlooked, a treasure hidden in plain sight, because those who sought only surface brilliance had never learned to recognize the deeper radiance of a cultivated mind and generous heart. When the lesson concluded and the children scattered homeward with their slates and primers, Sebastian introduced himself with the careful courtesy of one who had learned that grief teaches humility and they fell into conversation about the books that lined the schoolhouse shelves, discovering a shared love for Wordsworth and Coleridge, debating the merits of Pope's formalism against the emotional immediacy of the Romantic poets, their discussion ranging from literature to philosophy to the nature of beauty itself, and Beatrice felt something unfamiliar stirring within her chest, the dangerous, fragile beginning of hope that perhaps not all men measured worth by the standards that had found her wanting. Sebastian observed the way her face became animated when discussing ideas, the way her hands gestured expressively to emphasize a point, the way her laughter emerged unguarded and genuine when he made a particularly apt observation. And he saw what the fashionable world in its blindness had failed to perceive, that her eyes held depths of feeling and intelligence that rendered mere physical beauty a poor and shallow thing, that her smile carried a warmth that could sustain a man through the darkest winters of the soul, that her mind possessed a quickness and breadth that would make her the finest of companions for one who valued conversation over mere decoration. Before taking his leave, he asked with genuine diffidence whether he might call upon her at Thornwood Hall, perhaps to continue their discussion of literature and to seek her recommendations for his research into the regional landscape and customs, and Beatrice found herself agreeing with a hesitancy born of old wounds and newer caution, unused to sincere masculine attention that seemed to value her thoughts rather than merely tolerating them, uncertain whether this interest would prove genuine or whether it would fade as others had when the novelty of her intellectual companionship wore thin, and he remembered that society deemed her plain and unmarriageable. Yet as she walked home through the autumn woods, the leaves crunching beneath her feet and the late afternoon sun slanting through the branches to paint everything in shades of gold, she allowed herself the smallest measure of hope, thinking that perhaps in the country, far from London's ballrooms and cruel judgments, a different kind of story might be possible, one where the qualities she possessed, her mind, her heart, her capacity for genuine feeling, might be valued above the superficial attributes she had always lacked. And for the first time since that devastating night, when the Duke of Ashford's words had shattered her fragile confidence, she permitted herself to wonder whether someone might see her not as plain or unmarriageable, but simply as Beatrice, whole and worthy, exactly as she was. Sebastian's courtship unfolded with the quiet deliberation of a man who had known love and loss and understood that hearts, particularly wounded ones, required patience and gentleness rather than grand gestures or passionate declarations that might overwhelm before trust had been established. He arrived at Thornwood Hall 3 days after their initial meeting, bearing not flowers but a first edition of Coleridge's latest work, wrapped in plain paper and presented with the simple observation that he had thought she might appreciate it. And Beatrice found herself touched by this evidence that he had listened during their conversation, that he remembered her expressed admiration for the poet's exploration of imagination and nature. Their visit settled into a pattern as autumn deepened, long walks through the beech woods where the golden leaves created a canopy of light above them, conversations that ranged from the philosophical to the personal, discussions of poetry that revealed not merely literary opinions, but the shape of their interior lives, the experiences and losses and hopes that had formed them into the people they had become. Sebastian spoke of his late wife with the tender sorrow of one who had genuinely loved, explaining that her death in childbirth had left him hollow for years, until he discovered that immersing himself in poetry and study could transmute grief into something resembling purpose, and Beatrice recognized in his story an echo of her own transformation, her own attempt to fashion meaning from pain. He brought her wildflowers gathered from the hedgerows, nothing cultivated or expensive, just the simple beauty of hawthorn berries and late-blooming asters, and she pressed them between the pages of her books, marking the slow progress of a courtship that felt unlike anything she had imagined during those long London seasons when she had watched other girls receive roses and compliments while she remained invisible. When they discussed ideas, Sebastian never condescended or simplified, never treated her intellect as charming or unusual, but engaged with her thoughts as he would those of any respected colleague, debating with passion when they disagreed, conceding points when her arguments proved stronger, and this intellectual respect touched something deep within Beatrice that had always hungered for recognition beyond the superficial judgments of appearance and marriageability. Yet even as she felt herself drawn to him, even as she began to anticipate his visits with a flutter of something that might have been joy, The old fears whispered their poison in her quieter moments. Was this genuine attraction, or merely pity for a woman society had dismissed? Would he eventually see what the Duke of Ashford had seen and find her wanting? Could she trust this happiness, or would it prove as illusory as every other hope she had permitted herself to nurture before learning that hope itself was dangerous for those deemed unworthy of love? She caught herself sometimes watching Sebastian's face when he looked at her, searching for signs of disappointment or resignation, bracing for the inevitable moment when he would realize his mistake, when the peculiar enchantment of her conversation would fade, and he would remember that she was plain, unfashionable, unmarriageable by the standards that governed their world. But he continued to call, continued to seek her company, continued to look at her with something in his eyes that resembled wonder, and slowly, carefully, like a creature emerging from long hibernation, Beatrice felt the walls around her heart begin to crumble, felt herself beginning to believe in the possibility that perhaps, in this quiet corner of Derbyshire, far from London's cruel ballrooms, she might be seen and valued for exactly who she was. News of Lord Sebastian Hartley's courtship of Lady Beatrice Thornwood travelled with the peculiar velocity that gossip always achieves in the interconnected web of English society, carried from Derbyshire to London, in letters penned by provincial matrons eager to share the season's most unexpected development. And within a fortnight of Sebastian's first call at Thornwood Hall, the drawing-rooms and clubs of the capital buzzed with speculation about the widowed poet's interest in the very woman who had been dismissed as plain and unmarriageable just months before. The reactions varied according to the character and circumstances of those receiving the intelligence. Some expressed genuine surprise that anyone should court Lady Beatrice, their prejudices too deeply rooted to accommodate the possibility that she might possess qualities worth valuing, while others who remembered her intelligence and gentle manner wondered why they had never recognized these attributes as desirable, and still others seized upon the news as evidence that country isolation produced peculiar standards of beauty and worth that would never obtain in more fashionable circles. The Duke of Ashford heard the intelligence while taking brandy at White's, delivered casually by Lord Pemberton, who mentioned it as an amusing curiosity, and felt something strange and unwelcome twist in his chest, a sensation he could not immediately identify, but which manifested as a sharp irritation, entirely disproportionate to the significance of one unremarkable woman acquiring a suitor. He dismissed the feeling as mere surprise, perhaps a natural curiosity about why a respected poet and scholar should choose to court someone so thoroughly ordinary, and he refused to examine why his mind returned repeatedly to the information throughout the evening, why he found himself wondering what Sebastian Hartley saw in Lady Beatrice that he himself had failed to perceive, why the image of her quiet face kept surfacing in his thoughts, unbidden and unwelcome. Meanwhile, in Derbyshire, Captain James Worthing arrived to visit his old friend Sebastian, seeking respite from London society and the persistent matchmaking efforts of ambitious mothers who saw his military distinction and comfortable income as desirable despite his lack of title. And it was on his second day in the district that he encountered Lady Beatrice under circumstances that would alter the trajectory of her increasingly complicated romantic situation. He had been riding through the lanes near Thornwood when his mount stumbled badly, wrenching its foreleg in a rabbit hole, and while he examined the injury with growing concern for the animal's welfare, Beatrice came upon the scene during her afternoon walk and immediately demonstrated a knowledge of horse physiology that surprised him, directing him to the Thornwood stables, where she personally supervised the application of cold compresses and the preparation of a poultice, her hands gentle and capable as she soothed the frightened animal with quiet words and steady competence. Captain Worthing, accustomed to fashionable ladies who would have shrieked at the sight of an injured horse or fainted at the prospect of touching an animal in distress, found himself captivated by this woman's practical kindness, by the intelligence evident in her treatment of the injury, by the compassion that made her stay until she was satisfied the horse would recover, and when Sebastian later mentioned that this was the Lady Beatrice he had been courting, James felt the unmistakable stirring of interest that had eluded him through countless London ballrooms and tedious social engagements. He began finding excuses to call at Thornwood Hall, ostensibly to check on his recovering mount, but truly to seek Beatrice's company, and she found herself simultaneously flattered and bewildered by the attentions of two men, where previously she had attracted none, her old insecurities whispering that this sudden interest must be some cruel jest, even as her tentative hope suggested that perhaps, finally, she was being seen and valued for who she truly was, rather than dismissed for who she was not. Winter approached with the particular swiftness that characterizes English seasons, the golden abundance of autumn giving way to bare branches and frost-silvered mornings, and it was during the first week of December that Mr. Nicholas Chambers arrived in Derbyshire, seeking inspiration for a series of landscape paintings he had been commissioned to create for a wealthy patron's country house. He was young, perhaps 25, with the romantic appearance that society expected of artists, dark, curling hair that he wore slightly longer than fashion dictated, expressive hands stained with traces of paint that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove, and an intensity of observation that made those around him feel simultaneously seen and studied, as though he perceived depths and dimensions invisible to ordinary vision. It was by chance that he encountered Lady Beatrice on a cold morning when she stood in the Thornwood Gardens, scattering seeds for the winter birds, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, her movements economical and practiced as she ensured that the robins and finches and sparrows would have sustenance through the lean months, and Nicholas found himself arrested by the scene, not merely by its picturesque quality, though the composition of woman and birds and frost-touched evergreens possessed an undeniable aesthetic appeal, but by something in her bearing, a quality of focused attention and gentle purpose that suggested character worth capturing on canvas. He approached with the peculiar boldness of artists who see the world as material for their craft, introducing himself and asking, with more directness than strict propriety permitted, whether she would consent to sit for her portrait, explaining that he wished to capture not landscape alone, but the essential character of this place and its people, and something in her face, the intelligence in her grey eyes, the grace in her movements as she turned toward him, the warmth of her smile despite the cold, convinced him that she embodied precisely what he sought to immortalize. Beatrice, startled by this request from a stranger, felt the familiar warring impulses of her wounded heart, the part that whispered he must be mocking her, that no artist would genuinely wish to paint someone society deemed plain, and the newer, more fragile hope that perhaps he saw something worth capturing, something that Sebastian and James had also perceived and valued. She agreed tentatively, and Nicholas began what would become his most ambitious work, spending hours sketching her in various attitudes, reading by the library fire, walking through the winter gardens, seated at the pianoforte, though she played indifferently, and with each session he grew more convinced that he had discovered a subject of remarkable depth, telling her with an artist's passionate certainty that beauty resided not in the conventional arrangement of features, but in the animation of intelligence, the evidence of kindness, the authenticity of a soul uncorrupted by vanity or pretense. Within a fortnight, the village and surrounding county hummed with gossip about Lady Beatrice's three suitors. The poet, the captain, and now the artist and letters flew to London, describing the remarkable transformation of her prospects, the unprecedented situation of a woman dismissed as unmarriageable, now possessing an abundance of admirers, and society struggled to reconcile this intelligence with their established judgments, some suggesting that country isolation produced peculiar standards, while others began to wonder whether they had been wrong in their initial assessment, whether there existed qualities of value that their superficial scrutiny had failed to perceive. The Duke of Ashford found himself in the unprecedented and unwelcome position of being unable to direct his own thoughts, discovering that his mind returned with obsessive regularity to the matter of Lady Beatrice Thornwood and her accumulating suitors, despite his repeated attempts to dismiss the subject as beneath his notice and irrelevant to his own concerns. He told himself that his interest was merely idle curiosity, the natural reaction of any observer to a situation so peculiar as to border on the absurd that a woman he had dismissed as plain and unmarriageable should suddenly acquire not one but three admirers, suggested either a collective madness among the gentlemen of Derbyshire or some quality he had failed to perceive, and surely it was reasonable to wonder which explanation obtained. Yet this rationalization satisfied him less each day, and he found his irritation growing whenever fresh intelligence arrived from the north, carried in letters read aloud at his club by men who found the situation vastly entertaining, who speculated about what Lord Sebastian or Captain Worthing or Mr. Chambers saw in Lady Beatrice, who wondered whether country isolation truly did produce such radically different standards of feminine appeal. His friends noticed his distraction, the way his jaw tightened when her name was mentioned, the manner in which he withdrew into brooding silence when the conversation turned to her multiple suitors, and Lord Pemberton, who possessed both keen observation and a talent for provocation, remarked with studied casualness that it was remarkable how the plain and unmarriageable Lady Beatrice had transformed into Derbyshire's most sought-after prize. And wasn't it ironic that the very woman Ashford had declared a tragedy of wasted breeding now had 3 honourable gentlemen competing for her hand? The observation struck like a blade between his ribs, and Ashford felt something he had never before experienced in his privileged, admired existence, the bitter taste of regret, the uncomfortable recognition that he had perhaps been wrong, that he had dismissed something of value through blindness born of arrogance and society's shallow standards. He attempted to remember Lady Beatrice as she had appeared that night in the ballroom, tried to recall what he had seen that prompted such cruel assessment, but the memory had grown hazy, and what emerged instead were fragments he had not consciously registered. At the time, the intelligence evident in her face as she read, the grace of her posture despite her unfashionable height, and the way servants had smiled at her with genuine warmth, suggesting she treated them with kindness. Meanwhile, in Derbyshire, Beatrice struggled with an abundance that felt as disorienting as scarcity had once felt painful, wondering how she had transformed from a woman no one wanted into someone 3 worthy men claimed to admire, and whether this transformation was genuine or whether she was somehow deceiving them, whether they truly saw her or whether they saw some imagined version that would eventually disappoint them as reality intruded. She found herself paralyzed by choice after years of having no choices at all, uncertain which suitor's affection was deepest or truest, fearful that selecting one would reveal her judgment as flawed, that eventual disappointment would prove she had been right all along to believe herself unmarriageable, that this strange season of attention was an aberration that could not possibly last. Sebastian chose a morning in late January for his proposal, when the world lay frozen beneath a crystalline layer of ice that transformed familiar landscapes into something ethereal and strange, and he asked Beatrice to walk with him through the woods behind Thornwood House, where bare branches caught the pale sunlight and scattered it in fragments across the snow-covered path. They walked in companionable silence for a time, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, until they reached a small clearing where a frozen stream created a natural mirror reflecting the winter sky, and there he stopped, turning to face her with an expression of such gentle earnestness that Beatrice felt her heart contract with something between hope and fear. He spoke of how their acquaintance had transformed his understanding of what marriage might be, how he had thought himself content with solitude after losing his first wife, until meeting someone who reminded him that partnership could be not merely pleasant, but profound, and that true companionship resided in the meeting of minds and hearts rather than in superficial attractions or social convenience. He offered her not passion or grand romance, but something perhaps more valuable: respect, intellectual equality, a shared life built on genuine affection and common purpose, and he asked with quiet sincerity whether she would consider becoming his wife, creating together the kind of union that honored both their natures. Beatrice, standing in the frozen clearing with this kind, thoughtful man, offering her everything she had believed herself unworthy of receiving, felt tears gathering in her eyes as she asked him for time to consider his proposal, needing space to untangle gratitude from genuine affection, to determine whether her feelings ran deep enough to sustain a lifetime. Sebastian accepted her request with the same grace that characterized all his actions, telling her there was no urgency, that a decision of such magnitude deserved careful contemplation. That same week brought Captain Worthing to her door with his own declaration, speaking with military directness about the courage and strength he perceived in her character, qualities he valued more than beauty or fortune, and asking whether she might consider him as a potential husband, offering protection, devotion, and the kind of steadfast loyalty he had learned in service to crown and country. Then, 3 days after Worthing's proposal, Nicholas Chambers presented her with the completed portrait, and Beatrice stood before the canvas in stunned silence. Unable to reconcile the woman he had painted with her own self-perception, he had captured something in her expression, a quality of intelligence and warmth and quiet strength that she had never seen in any mirror, and had rendered her not conventionally beautiful, but undeniably compelling, had shown her the woman these three men claimed to see when they looked at her. Three honorable men seeking her hand, offering different versions of the future, and Beatrice found herself suspended between disbelief and tentative joy, wondering how she had travelled from that London ballroom where the Duke of Ashford's cruel words had shattered her spirit to this unprecedented abundance of genuine regard, and whether she possessed the wisdom to choose correctly among men who saw value where society had seen only deficiency. The Duke of Ashford discovered that he could no longer maintain the comfortable fiction that his interest in Lady Beatrice Thornwood constituted mere idle curiosity or passing concern, that the obsessive quality of his thoughts indicated anything less than the complete unraveling of his carefully constructed emotional defenses, and this realization arrived with devastating clarity. One evening at his club, when Lord Pemberton read aloud yet another letter from Derbyshire, describing how Lord Sebastian, Captain Worthing, and Mr. Chambers all vied for Lady Beatrice's favour, and Ashford felt such violent jealousy surge through him that he crushed the crystal glass he'd been holding, sending shards scattering across the table and drawing startled looks from his companions. He dismissed himself abruptly, retreating to his London townhouse where he paced his study through the night, finally confronting truths he had spent months avoiding, that he had dismissed something precious because of superficial standards he now recognized as meaningless, that he had valued appearance over substance in a way that revealed not her deficiency but his own, that the woman he had so cruelly labeled unmarriageable possessed qualities far more valuable than conventional beauty. He forced himself to remember her as she had been that night in the ballroom, and what emerged now were details. His arrogance had blinded him to then the intelligence evident in her face as she read, suggesting a mind of considerable depth, the kindness she had shown to a clumsy servant who spilled wine near her chair, reassuring the frightened girl when others would have complained, the quiet wit he had overheard in her conversation with an elderly gentleman, demonstrating both learning and humour, the grace of her posture despite society's judgment of her height as unfashionable. He realized with mounting horror that he had encountered something rare and dismissed it as common, had been offered the possibility of genuine connection and rejected it in favor of empty admiration from women who valued his title more than his character, and his own cruel words, plain and utterly unmarriageable. A tragedy of wasted breeding now tortured him with their stupidity and cruelty. The knowledge that three honourable men recognized her value, while he had been blind to it, consumed him with unprecedented jealousy, not the petty jealousy of a man deprived of a possession he wanted, but the profound jealousy of someone who had thrown away treasure and now watched others claim it, who understood too late what he had lost through his own foolishness. He began making discreet inquiries about her current situation, learning details that increased both his regret and his desperate need to somehow undo the damage he had caused, that she had withdrawn from society entirely after that night, that she now devoted herself to charitable works in her village, that the three men courting her were all respectable and sincere in their regard, that she seemed to be genuinely considering their proposals. The decision formed in torment and certainty he had to see her, had to offer the apology she deserved even if she rejected it, had to attempt to win what he had so callously discarded even though he had no right to ask and less reason to hope, because the alternative was spending the rest of his life knowing he had destroyed his own chance at something real through arrogance and shallow judgment. Spring arrived with the kind of suddenness that transforms English landscapes overnight, bringing warmth that melted winter's remnants and coaxed crocuses from cold earth, painting Thornwood House's gardens in shades of yellow and purple and tender green. And it was on one such morning that the Duke of Ashford's carriage appeared on the estate's drive, uninvited and unexpected, creating considerable consternation among the household staff, who recognized his crest and understood the complicated history between their mistress and this particular nobleman. Beatrice learned of his arrival while sitting in her favorite corner of the garden, a sheltered spot beneath an ancient oak where she often read in pleasant weather, and she felt her heart contract with a volatile mixture of emotions, shock, anger, anxiety, and something she refused to name that might have been anticipation, as she watched him approach across the lawn with a hesitant gait entirely unlike the arrogant stride she remembered from that London ballroom. He stopped several paces away, as if uncertain of his welcome or perhaps simply recognizing that he had forfeited any right to proximity. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of its former confidence, stumbling over words that clearly cost him considerable effort to produce, an apology so inadequate to the magnitude of his transgression that its very insufficiency paradoxically demonstrated its sincerity, for he acknowledged that no words could undo the cruelty he had inflicted, that his judgment had been shallow and his behavior inexcusable, that he had spent the past months thinking of nothing but her and slowly understanding the depth of his blindness in dismissing something precious because it failed to conform to meaningless standards of conventional attractiveness. He confessed that he had come not with any expectation of forgiveness, but simply because he could no longer bear the distance he could not endure, knowing that 3 honorable men pursued what he had so callously rejected without at least attempting to express his regret and his transformed understanding. And as he spoke, Beatrice felt cold, dignified anger crystallizing within her, replacing the confused emotions of moments before with something clear and focused and utterly unforgiving. She rose from her seat with deliberate grace, her book falling forgotten to the grass, and in a voice of measured fury, she recounted the pain his words had caused, describing how she had fled London in humiliation, how his casual cruelty had confirmed every insecurity she harbored about her worth, how she had needed to rebuild her sense of self through months of solitary struggle in this very place he now invaded with his belated remorse, and she told him with cutting precision that she currently entertained proposals from 3 honorable gentlemen who had valued her from their first meeting, who saw in her qualities that his shallow gaze had entirely missed, and that she had absolutely no interest in a duke whose sudden regard seemed motivated not by genuine appreciation, but by the covetous impulse to possess what others desired, by competitive instinct rather than authentic affection. She dismissed him then, turning her back with finality and walking toward the house without awaiting his response, leaving him standing alone in the spring garden with an expression of such devastation that the footman who witnessed the scene would later describe it as watching a man receive news of his own execution, and though Ashford stood motionless for several long moments after her departure, he eventually returned to his carriage and left Thornwood House, his first attempt at redemption ending in comprehensive and deserved rejection. Ashford refused to leave Derbyshire despite his comprehensive rejection, taking rooms at the White Hart Inn in the village, where his presence caused considerable speculation and no small amount of scandal, for dukes did not typically lodge in modest country establishments nor linger in provincial areas without compelling social obligations, and his compelling obligation was one he could not explain to the curious innkeeper or the gossiping villagers who watched him with fascinated attention. He began what could only be described as a quiet campaign of demonstration rather than declaration, appearing at village charity events where he knew Beatrice would be present, contributing generously but anonymously to the causes she championed, attempting through actions rather than words to show the transformation of perspective that had overtaken him in those months of tortured self-examination in London. He attended the Sunday service at the small parish church where Beatrice taught children their letters after the sermon, sitting in the back pew and observing how she patiently guided small fingers over slate boards, how her face illuminated with genuine joy when a struggling child finally mastered a difficult word, how she treated the poorest labourer's daughter with the same respect she showed the vicar's son, and he began to understand with accumulating clarity exactly what made her remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with symmetry of features or fashionable proportions. He watched from careful distance as she walked with Lord Sebastian through the meadow paths, discussing what appeared to be poetry or philosophy, given their animated gestures and serious expressions. He watched Captain Worthing present her with a bouquet of wildflowers after she had helped organize provisions for wounded soldiers at the county assembly. Watched Mr. Chambers show her preliminary sketches for his painting, while she smiled with an expression that suggested she still could not quite believe someone saw beauty in her face worth capturing on canvas. Meanwhile, Beatrice tried desperately to ignore his persistent presence, focusing her attention on the difficult decision before her regarding which of her 3 honorable suitors deserved her acceptance, yet she found her awareness continually drawn to the Duke, who observed from the periphery of every event, who never approached, but whose gaze she could feel, tracking her movements with an intensity that unsettled her careful composure. Part of her felt a vengeful satisfaction in his attention, a vindication that the woman he had dismissed as unmarriageable now commanded not only the regard of three worthy gentlemen, but also the tormented focus of the Duke himself. Yet another part remained wounded by the memory of his cruelty, uncertain whether his transformation represented genuine change or merely the acquisitive obsession of a man accustomed to possessing whatever he desired. She told herself she had no interest in his redemption, that his belated recognition of her worth meant nothing compared to the immediate appreciation shown by Sebastian, James, and Nicholas. Yet she could not deny the traitorous flutter of her heart when she glimpsed him in the village square or felt his eyes upon her during charity gatherings, could not quite suppress the confused tangle of emotions his presence evoked, despite her determination to remain unmoved by his patient, persistent, utterly unexpected campaign of quiet devotion. Lord Pembroke arrived in Derbyshire on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, his carriage bearing a crest that had seen better days, much like the Earl himself, a dissolute nobleman whose estates were mortgaged beyond redemption and whose reputation in London society had deteriorated to the point where even the most desperate hostesses no longer issued him invitations, and he had heard through the intricate network of gossip that sustained the ton about Lady Beatrice Thornwood's sudden transformation from overlooked wallflower to sought-after prize with 3 honourable suitors and a considerable dowry that might rescue his failing fortunes. He made his interest known with an aggression that bordered on impropriety, cornering Beatrice at a village assembly where she had gone reluctantly at Sebastian's gentle urging, pressing too close and speaking with a familiarity entirely unwarranted by their brief acquaintance, his breath carrying the sour taint of wine, and his eyes assessing her with a mercenary calculation that made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Sebastian intervened with the quiet authority of a gentleman defending a lady's honour, requesting politely but firmly that Pembroke step away and afford Lady Beatrice appropriate distance, but the dissolute Earl responded with sneering contempt, his voice carrying across the assembly room as he questioned what desperate circumstances would drive multiple men to pursue such an unremarkable specimen, calling Beatrice plain in terms far cruder than even Ashford's original dismissal, and suggesting that her suitors must be motivated by financial considerations rather than any genuine attraction to a woman so singularly lacking physical appeal. The assembled company gasped at this public insult, Sebastian's face flushing with anger as he stepped forward to deliver what would clearly be a physical response to such intolerable rudeness. But before he could act, the Duke of Ashford moved with startling speed from his position near the refreshment table, where he had been observing the evening's proceedings with his usual careful attention, interposing himself between Sebastian and Pembroke, and addressing the latter in a voice of glacial fury that cut through the shocked silence like a blade through silk. He challenged Pembroke formally and immediately, his words precise and uncompromising, as he demanded satisfaction for the unforgivable insult delivered to Lady Beatrice, and though Pembroke attempted to laugh off the challenge with blustering bravado, the steel in Ashford's eyes and the absolute certainty in his bearing made clear that this was not a matter subject to negotiation or dismissal. They met at dawn the following morning in a secluded meadow beyond the village boundaries, Sebastian and Captain Worthing serving as witnesses despite their complicated positions as Beatrice's suitors, and when the pistols fired, Ashford's shot struck Pembroke's shoulder with deliberate precision, wounding but not killing, delivering both punishment and warning before the defeated Earl was helped from the field by his trembling second, later departing Derbyshire that same afternoon with his tail between his legs and his pursuit of Lady Beatrice permanently abandoned. The village erupted in shocked speculation about a duke fighting a duel over a lady he had publicly scorned months earlier, the irony not lost on anyone who remembered or had heard tales of his original cruel assessment, and Beatrice found herself in a state of profound confusion about Ashford's motivations, unable to reconcile the man who had wounded her so deeply with this fierce champion, who had literally shed blood in defense of her honor, questioning whether his actions stemmed from genuine transformation or merely possessive instinct, from authentic feeling or performative guilt. Sir Reginald Frost arrived in Derbyshire less than a week after Pembroke's ignominious departure, A rake of the worst variety whose handsome face and silver tongue had ruined more than one innocent young woman, and whose presence in any respectable gathering was tolerated only because his family connections remained impeccable despite his personal dissolution, and he began immediately spreading rumors throughout the county with the deliberate malice of a man who took pleasure in destroying reputations for his own entertainment, suggesting in drawing rooms and at card tables that Lady Beatrice's sudden acquisition of multiple suitors indicated something improper in her character, that no truly virtuous woman would encourage the attentions of so many gentlemen simultaneously, that her sudden popularity after years of being overlooked suggested she had employed methods unbecoming to a lady of quality to secure masculine interest. The whispers spread with the inexorable speed of all malicious gossip, carried from the assembly rooms to the village shops, to the Sunday services, where respectable matrons began regarding Beatrice with speculation rather than admiration. And Captain Worthing, whose strict code of honor had been forged in the brutal crucible of military campaigns, and whose respect for Beatrice's virtue was absolute and unshakable, demanded satisfaction from Sir Reginald with the cold fury of a soldier who had faced death too many times to fear a duel with a dissolute wastrel. Before the meeting could be arranged, however, the Duke of Ashford intervened with an authority that brooked no argument, claiming the primary right to defend Lady Beatrice's honor as the gentleman whose original cruelty had first exposed her to society's judgment, whose failure to recognize her worth had created the circumstances that now subjected her to such vicious speculation. And though Captain Worthing initially resisted this appropriation of his rightful role as her suitor and protector, something in Ashford's expression, a haunted desperation that transcended mere guilt or performative nobility, convinced him to step aside and allow the Duke to meet Sir Reginald in his stead. They met at dawn in the same meadow where Ashford had faced Pembroke, the morning mist rising from the grass like spirits witnessing the clash of honor against depravity, and when the swords were drawn, Ashford fought with a controlled ferocity that shocked the seconds who observed, driving Sir Reginald back with precise strikes that demonstrated both superior skill and barely leashed rage, until the rake's blade clattered to the ground, and he stood disarmed and humiliated, forced to publicly retract his vicious rumors and promised to quit the county immediately upon pain of facing Ashford's wrath again, with potentially fatal consequences. Beatrice, learning of this second duel fought in her defense, sought out Ashford in the gardens of her family's estate, where he walked alone in the afternoon light, his coat bearing a tear from Sir Reginald's desperate final lunge, and she confronted him with a confusion that bordered on anguish, demanding to know why he persisted in fighting battles on her behalf when she had given him no encouragement, no forgiveness, no indication that his championship was desired or welcome, and his answer came quiet and devastated, spoken with eyes that held more pain than any physical wound could inflict, because he had failed to fight for her when his silence might have prevented the initial wound, when a single word of defense in that London ballroom months ago could have spared her the humiliation that had driven her into exile, and now he could not seem to stop fighting even though he knew he had forfeited any right to her regard, even though each duel he won brought him no closer to earning what he had so carelessly destroyed. The Marquess of Blackwood descended upon Derbyshire like a storm cloud heavy with malicious intent, arriving in a carriage far grander than necessary, and making his presence known with the deliberate ostentation of a man who measured his worth by the envy he inspired in others. And he was indeed the Duke of Ashford's most bitter rival, a resentment that had festered since their school days, when Ashford had bested him in academics, athletics, and every social grace that mattered to young men of their station, a rivalry that had only intensified through the years as Ashford's consequence grew, while Blackwood's remained perpetually in second place despite his higher title and greater wealth. He had heard through the intricate web of society gossip about Ashford's inexplicable interest in Lady Beatrice Thornwood, the plain wallflower he had publicly scorned months earlier, and Blackwood saw in this situation an opportunity too delicious to resist, a chance to humiliate his old rival by stealing away the woman Ashford now pursued with such desperate intensity, to demonstrate once again that a marquis could always supersede a mere duke when he chose to exert his superiority. Blackwood made his play with calculated charm, calling upon Beatrice at her family's estate with gifts of extravagant jewelry, entirely inappropriate for a first acquaintance, and offering her a future as a marchioness, with all the consequence and luxury such a position entailed, speaking of his estates in Scotland and his houses in London and Bath as though their magnificence alone should secure her immediate acceptance, and when Beatrice politely but firmly declined his offer, explaining with gentle dignity that she could not accept the addresses of a gentleman she barely knew, and for whom she felt no particular regard. Blackwood's charm evaporated like morning dew under harsh sun, replaced by an aggressive persistence that bordered on intimidation. He cornered her at the next village assembly, blocking her path to the refreshment table and speaking in tones that grew increasingly demanding as he insisted she reconsider that she recognized the extraordinary honor he offered by elevating a woman of her limited attractions to such an exalted position, that her refusal demonstrated either shocking ingratitude or willful stupidity, and his hand had actually grasped her arm with proprietary force when Ashford appeared beside them with the sudden violence of a lightning strike, his fist connecting with Blackwood's jaw before words could be exchanged, sending the Marquis stumbling backward into a table laden with punch bowls that shattered in a spectacular cascade of crystal and liquid across the assembly room floor. The challenge was issued immediately amid the shocked gasps of the assembled company, Blackwood's rage at the public humiliation overwhelming any prudent consideration of the danger, and they met 2 mornings later in the grey pre-dawn light, with pistols rather than swords, the more deadly choice reflecting the lethal seriousness of their mutual hatred. And when the shots rang out across the misty field, Ashford felt the searing burn of Blackwood's ball grazing his left shoulder, even as his own shot struck the Marquis's thigh, wounding but not killing, both men bleeding, but Ashford still standing straight while Blackwood collapsed, cursing into the damp grass, forced to withdraw from Derbyshire in disgrace, while London society erupted in scandalized speculation about the Duke of Ashford fighting yet another duel over Lady Beatrice Thornwood, the woman he had once called plain and unmarriageable, the irony so profound that even the most oblivious observers could not fail to notice the extraordinary reversal, the cosmic justice of a proud duke, now shedding blood repeatedly to defend the honor of the lady he had so carelessly wounded with his thoughtless cruelty. Count Adolphus von Richter arrived in Derbyshire with the polished sophistication that characterized continental nobility, a tall, fair-haired gentleman whose impeccable manners and cultured accent immediately distinguished him from the English gentry who had preceded him in their pursuit of Lady Beatrice's attention, and he had come to England ostensibly to study its agricultural innovations for implementation on his family's extensive Prussian estates, but found himself unexpectedly enchanted when he encountered Beatrice at a scholarly lecture on crop rotation techniques, where she was the only woman present, and asked questions that demonstrated a thorough understanding of agricultural economics that astonished the assembled gentlemen. Von Richter began his courtship with European flair, sending hothouse flowers that could not be grown in England's climate, quoting German philosophers in conversations that revealed his formidable education, and treating Beatrice with a deference that suggested he saw her as an intellectual equal rather than merely a potential wife, and his genuine interest in her thoughts on politics, science, and literature created yet another complication in her already impossibly tangled romantic situation. A fourth honorable suitor, whose attention seemed to validate her worth in ways that still felt surreal after years of being dismissed and overlooked. The Duke of Ashford, observing this latest development from his increasingly permanent residence at the village inn, felt his torment multiply exponentially. The sight of Beatrice walking through the spring gardens, deep in philosophical discussion with the cultured Count, igniting jealousies he had never experienced, even during his most competitive moments in London society, and he began to understand with devastating clarity that this was his punishment for the casual cruelty he had inflicted months ago, to watch other men recognize and cherish what he had been too blind and arrogant to see until it was irretrievably beyond his reach. The crisis came during an evening gathering at the home of a local baronet, when von Richter, warmed by excellent wine and the admiration of his English hosts, made what he likely intended as a sophisticated compliment, but which emerged as a subtly disparaging observation about English women's lack of intellectual cultivation compared to their continental counterparts, suggesting with elegant condescension that ladies of the German courts engaged in philosophical discourse that would quite overwhelm the more domestically focused English gentlewomen, and though he did not mention Beatrice specifically, the implication that she represented an unusual exception to her countrywomen's general inadequacy hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot. Ashford challenged him before the words had fully settled, his fury at this veiled insult to Beatrice overriding any diplomatic consideration for von Richter's foreign status or the potential international complications such a duel might create, and they met at dawn in a meadow, now becoming distressingly familiar, as the site of Ashford's defence of Beatrice's honour. The fourth such meeting in as many months, and when the swords clashed, Ashford fought with a desperate intensity that bordered on reckless, sustaining a deep cut along his right forearm that bled profusely, even as he pressed his attack until von Richter, recognizing that the Duke would not yield regardless of injury, formally apologized for any offence his words had caused and agreed to withdraw both his implied criticism and his suit for Lady Beatrice's hand. Beatrice, learning of this fourth duel from her increasingly concerned brother Edmund, began finally to perceive the pattern emerging from Ashford's repeated combats, understanding that this was not performance or guilt-driven penance, but something deeper and more genuine. A protection offered not because he expected reward, but because he could not bear to allow anyone, regardless of their intentions or station, to diminish or disparage her in even the most subtle ways, and she felt something shift in her heart, despite her determined resistance, a reluctant recognition that the man fighting and bleeding for her honour bore little resemblance to the arrogant Duke, who had wounded her so carelessly in that London ballroom that now seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. Mr. Aldous Kent arrived in Derbyshire with the calculated purpose of a businessman evaluating an investment opportunity, a wealthy merchant who had made his considerable fortune in manufacturing and trade, and now sought what money alone could never purchase, the respectability and social elevation that came only through marriage into the aristocracy, and he had heard through commercial channels that intersected occasionally with society gossip about Lady Beatrice Thornwood, a gentlewoman of impeccable breeding, whose sudden popularity among suitors suggested she might be practical enough to consider an arrangement that would benefit them both without the complications of romantic sentiment. He presented himself at her family's estate with the directness of a man accustomed to negotiating contracts, offering Beatrice a proposition so coldly transactional it took her breath away: marriage in name only, separate establishments, complete freedom to pursue her charitable and intellectual interests with unlimited funds at her disposal, in exchange for the use of her title and family connections to secure his entry into circles that would otherwise remain forever closed to a man of commerce, regardless of his wealth. And he spoke of this arrangement as though it were a perfectly reasonable business partnership, rather than the insult it truly represented, as though she were a commodity to be acquired, rather than a woman deserving of genuine affection and respect. Beatrice's refusal was immediate and coldly polite, her dignity intact even as she showed him to the door, but Kent had made his offer in the morning room while the windows stood open to the spring air, and the Duke of Ashford, who had been walking the grounds as had become his habit during these months of patient waiting and painful observation, heard every calculated word of Kent's mercenary proposal and felt something inside him snap with the violence of a tree branch breaking under winter ice. He was through the window before conscious thought could intervene, his hands closing around Kent's collar and dragging the merchant toward the garden with murderous intent, demanding satisfaction for an insult so profound it transcended even the previous affronts that had led to 4 already fought duels. And Kent, recognizing belatedly that he had miscalculated catastrophically in offering such a cold arrangement to a lady who inspired this level of protective fury, stammered acceptance of the challenge, while already plotting how to leave the county before dawn, could require him to actually face Ashford's pistol. But Beatrice, watching Ashford's rage transform his handsome features into something almost frightening in its intensity, understanding suddenly that he was moments away from either killing Kent or being killed himself in the reckless state that currently possessed him, did something she had never done before. She stepped directly between them, her small frame creating a physical barrier that Ashford could not move without moving her, and she demanded, in a voice that shook with emotion, that they stop this madness immediately, that no more blood be shed over words spoken by fools and fortune hunters, that she could not bear to watch another duel, fought nominally in her defense when she had never asked for such protection, and increasingly could not distinguish whether these fights arose from guilt, obsession, or something deeper and more genuine that terrified her to contemplate. Ashford released Kent, who fled with undignified haste, and turned to face Beatrice, with eyes that held such raw anguish she felt her carefully maintained emotional distance finally, irrevocably crumble, and when she asked him the question that had haunted her through all these months, whether he fought from guilt over his past cruelty, or from genuine feeling that might justify the risk he took repeatedly with his life and honor, he broke entirely, his confession pouring out like blood from a mortal wound, admitting that he loved her with a desperation that consumed his every waking thought, and that he had loved her since the terrible moment. He began reviewing every memory of her and seeing with devastating clarity all that his arrogance and superficiality had blinded him to, that he expected nothing from her and deserved even less, but could not stop himself from fighting for her honor, because no one had fought for her when his cruel words had wounded her so deeply, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to prove himself worthy of even her forgiveness if she would allow it, though he had no right to ask even that small mercy from her. Beatrice stood at her bedroom window in the hours after Ashford's devastating confession, watching the spring dawn break over the Derbyshire hills with eyes that had not closed in sleep. Her mind, a tempest of conflicting emotions that refused to settle into any coherent pattern of understanding, and she found herself caught between the girl who had been so cruelly wounded in that London ballroom and the woman who had just watched a duke bleed from his fourth combat injury, sustained in defense of her honor, between justified anger at past cruelty and reluctant recognition of present transformation, between the safety of maintaining her emotional distance and the terrifying possibility of trusting someone who had already proven himself capable of inflicting deep wounds. 3 honorable suitors still waited patiently for her answer to their proposals. Sebastian with his gentle poetry and understanding heart, Captain Worthing with his steady courage and respectful admiration, Nicholas with his artist's perception of beauty others had missed, and yet she could not deny that her thoughts returned obsessively to the man who had no right to her consideration, the Duke who had dismissed her as plain and unmarriageable, and then proceeded to fight 5 duels against anyone who dared echo his own cruel assessment or offer her arrangements that fell short of the genuine devotion he claimed she deserved. Her brother Edmund found her there as morning light filled the room, and when she turned to him with questions she could barely articulate. He sat beside her and revealed what he had kept secret at Ashford's explicit request, that the Duke had been privately funding the village school, where Beatrice taught, the hospital where she tended the sick, every charitable project she had undertaken to transform her pain into purpose, asking for no recognition or acknowledgement, simply ensuring that the work she valued could continue and expand beyond what her own resources could support. This evidence of transformation, of a man who had learned to value what truly mattered, rather than the superficial standards that had once governed his judgments, shook something loose in Beatrice's carefully maintained defenses, and she asked her brother the question that terrified her most: could people truly change? Or did they simply become better at hiding their fundamental nature? And was Ashford's love genuine devotion, or merely the possessive obsession of a man who could not bear to lose what he had carelessly discarded? Edmund, who had observed Ashford's patient campaign over these months with the protective scrutiny of a brother who would not allow his sister to be wounded again, spoke with careful honesty about what he had witnessed: a genuine humility replacing former arrogance, a willingness to serve without recognition replacing the need for admiration, a protection offered not as performance but as instinct, and most tellingly, a love that asked for nothing in return, that fought for her honor even when she had explicitly rejected him, that bled for her dignity even when she offered him no encouragement. Beatrice spent the following days in anguished contemplation, walking the gardens where Ashford had first apologized and later nearly killed a man for offering her a loveless arrangement, trying to understand her own heart beneath the layers of protective anger and lingering hurt, and she began to recognize with reluctant clarity that somewhere in the months since that spring confrontation she had fallen in love, not with the arrogant Duke who had wounded her, but with the transformed man who had learned to see true value, who had been willing to fight and bleed repeatedly to defend what he had once been too blind to recognize, And this realization brought not joy but terror, because loving him meant trusting him with the power to wound her again, meant choosing courage over the safety of sustained anger, meant believing in transformation, despite every reasonable doubt that whispered warnings about the impossibility of fundamental change in human nature. Beatrice knew with the clarity that comes only from painful self-honesty that she could not in good conscience accept any proposal while her heart remained divided and confused, and so she requested private audiences with each of her 3 honorable suitors, beginning with Lord Sebastian Hartley, who received her in the library where they had spent so many pleasant hours discussing literature and philosophy, and when she spoke to him with trembling voice about her uncertainty and confusion, about feelings that pulled her in directions she had not anticipated and could not fully explain, he listened with the patient kindness that had first drawn her to him, and then said something that shattered her careful composure. He had known for weeks that her heart was not entirely his to claim, had seen it in the way her eyes followed the Duke of Ashford during village gatherings, even when she pretended indifference, had recognized in her defensive anger toward Ashford the particular intensity that comes only from caring too much rather than too little, and while this knowledge brought him genuine sorrow, because he had come to love her truly and deeply, he would not trap her in a marriage where part of her heart belonged elsewhere, for she deserved the wholeness of love rather than the comfortable companionship he could offer. Captain James Worthing received her confession with the steady courage of a man who had faced death on battlefields and survived, listening, as she explained, with halting words, that she held him in highest esteem and deepest respect, but could not offer him the uncomplicated devotion he deserved, and he took her hand with gentle firmness and told her that he had suspected as much when he observed her reaction to Ashford's duels, the particular quality of fear in her eyes that spoke of caring despite herself, and while he had hoped that respect and compatible temperaments might be enough foundation for happiness, he recognized that she needed more than comfortable affection, and needed the passionate intensity of love that transformed and challenged and demanded courage, and he withdrew his suit with dignity and tact and friendship offered for whatever future she chose. Nicholas Chambers, the artist who had painted her portrait and captured beauty she had never seen in herself, met her in his temporary studio, where the completed canvas still rested on its easel, and before she could speak the difficult words she had prepared, he gestured to the painting and asked her to look at it honestly, to see what he had seen and captured, not merely intelligence and kindness, but a woman in love, a woman transformed by the terrifying vulnerability of caring for someone who had the power to wound her deeply, and the face in that portrait was not the face she wore when discussing poetry with Sebastian or tending horses with Captain Worthing, but the face she wore when watching Ashford fight his foolish, dangerous, necessary duels in her defense. She wept then, releasing months of confusion and resistance and fear, and Nicholas handed her his handkerchief and told her with an artist's perception that some subjects could only be painted once, that he had captured her in that particular moment of transformation and would treasure the work always, but he recognized that the story it told was not one in which he featured as the hero, and he too withdrew with grace and genuine wishes for her happiness. When they had all departed, these 3 honorable men, who had seen value where society saw plainness, who had offered her devotion when she felt herself unworthy of notice, Beatrice stood alone in her family's summer garden as afternoon light slanted through the roses her mother had planted years ago, and she acknowledged the truth she had been fighting since that spring morning when she had stepped between Ashford and certain violence she had fallen in love. Not with the arrogant duke who had wounded her, but with the transformed man who had learned to fight for what mattered, who had bled repeatedly to defend honor he had once carelessly destroyed, and now that her honorable suitors had gracefully withdrawn, she could no longer hide behind their competing claims or use their presence as shield against confronting what terrified her most. The Duke of Ashford appeared at the garden gate as though summoned by her thoughts, his face showing the strain of these months of patient waiting and painful uncertainty, and when Beatrice asked him the question that had haunted her through sleepless nights, why he continued fighting for her when she had given him no encouragement, no sign that his devotion would ever be returned, no hope that his patient campaign might succeed, he answered, with the devastating simplicity of absolute truth, "Because you deserve to be fought for, because no one fought for you when my cruelty wounded you, because I failed you when silence would have been mercy, and my careless words were violence, and I cannot undo that failure, but I can ensure that no one ever again questions your worth or offers you less than the complete devotion and genuine love that you have always deserved, even if I am not the man fortunate enough to offer it to you." Beatrice stood trembling in the summer garden, with the truth she could no longer deny burning in her chest like captured sunlight, and when she looked at the Duke of Ashford standing before her with his heart laid bare and his defences utterly abandoned, she recognized with devastating clarity that she loved him, not despite the cruel words he had spoken in that London ballroom, but in some strange alchemy, because of everything that had followed, because his transformation had mirrored her own journey from wounded girl hiding in corners to woman who had learned her worth through the patient devotion of honorable men and the fierce protection of one who had been willing to bleed, repeatedly, to defend what he had once carelessly destroyed. And this recognition brought not joy but terror, because loving him meant surrendering the protective anger that had sustained her through months of confusion, meant choosing courage over the safety of sustained resentment, meant believing that people could fundamentally change when every reasonable doubt whispered warnings about the foolishness of trusting someone who had already proven himself capable of inflicting deep wounds. She spoke then with voice that shook but did not break, telling him that she had spent these months fighting against the truth of her own heart, that she had watched him fight 5 duels and bleed from 4 wounds and endure her coldness and rejection with patience that should have been impossible for a man of his pride and position, and somewhere in that terrible, beautiful process of watching his transformation, she had fallen in love, not with the arrogant duke who had dismissed her as plain and unmarriageable, but with the man who had learned to see true value, who had funded her charitable works in secret, who had fought for her honor when he had no reasonable hope that his devotion would ever be returned. Ashford listened with expression that shifted from hope to wonder, to something very like fear, and when she finished speaking, he asked the question that mattered most: could she truly forgive him for the cruelty of those first words? Could she trust him with her heart when he had proven himself capable of such casual destruction? And did she love him for himself, or merely for the man he had tried to become to earn her regard? Beatrice moved closer to him in the garden, where roses bloomed in the summer heat, and replied with honesty that cost her every remaining defense that, yes, she loved him, but more than that, she loved what they had both become. Through this painful process she had learned her worth, through the recognition of men who saw past society's shallow standards, had discovered strength in the midst of humiliation, had transformed her pain into purpose and her isolation into meaningful work, while he had learned that true value lay not in superficial beauty or social position, but in intelligence and kindness, and the particular courage it took to remain gentle in a world that often rewarded hardness, and together they had both been transformed by love that demanded growth rather than mere comfort. His proposal came not with flowery speeches or dramatic gestures, but with simple, devastating truth, spoken in the fading summer light. He saw her completely, every sharp edge of intelligence and every soft curve of compassion, every moment of strength and every flash of vulnerability, and he loved her entirely, not as society's overlooked wallflower or as prize finally won, but as Beatrice, extraordinary and irreplaceable, and he would spend his lifetime proving himself worthy of the trust she was choosing to offer, despite every reasonable fear and justified hesitation. Her acceptance trembled on lips that had spoken rejection too many times, acknowledgement that she was choosing courage over safety, that she was trusting transformation over bitter experience, that she was surrendering to love despite the terror of potential future pain. And when she said yes with voice barely above a whisper, he gathered her into arms that had held swords in her defense and kissed her with reverence and hunger and desperate gratitude in the garden where he had first apologized and she had first begun the painful process of opening her carefully guarded heart to the possibility of forgiveness and love, and the redemption they had both earned through months of patience and pain and growth that had transformed them both into people capable of choosing each other, not from desperation or convenience, but from genuine recognition of worth and matching of souls. 3 years had passed since that summer afternoon when Beatrice had chosen courage over safety and offered her guarded heart to the man who had learned to fight for what mattered, and now the Duchess of Ashford stood in the drawing room of their London townhouse, preparing to host the monthly intellectual salon that had become renowned throughout society, not for the elevated title of its hostess, but for the brilliance of conversation and genuine exchange of ideas that occurred within these walls, where poets and philosophers gathered alongside politicians and reformers to discuss matters of substance rather than engaging in the shallow gossip that dominated most fashionable gatherings. And as she arranged chairs and ensured refreshments were prepared, she paused before the portrait Nicholas Chambers had painted years ago in Derbyshire, that captured image of a woman in transformation, now hanging in place of honor, where visitors could see not conventional beauty, but the intelligence and passion and particular courage that had first drawn 3 honorable suitors, eventually conquered the pride of a duke who had needed to fight 5 duels before understanding what true value meant. Her life had become something she could never have imagined during those painful months, as an overlooked wallflower reading poetry in ballroom corners, for her marriage to Ashford had proven to be genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and intellectual companionship, and the deep love that comes from choosing each other daily, despite the inevitable challenges and disagreements that arose between 2 strong-willed individuals who had both learned hard lessons about worth and recognition, and the courage required to be truly vulnerable with another human soul. She had transformed the duchy's charitable works into systematic programs that provided education for poor children and medical care for tenant families, and opportunities for women who needed alternatives to the limited choices society offered them, while Ashford consulted her on all estate matters and political decisions, valuing her sharp mind and compassionate heart in ways that made their partnership one of equals rather than the conventional hierarchy most aristocratic marriages maintained. And together they had created a life rich with meaning and purpose beyond the superficial concerns of rank and appearance that had once seemed to matter so desperately. Their 2 children played now in the nursery upstairs, a daughter with her mother's intelligent eyes and a son with his father's determination, both being raised to value character over beauty and substance over social position, and the libraries throughout their various properties overflowed with books. Ashford still presented to her on birthdays and anniversaries, and ordinary Tuesdays when he found something he thought would delight her mind, while the gardens she had designed bloomed in every season with careful attention to beauty that served purpose rather than mere decoration. That evening, before their guests arrived, Ashford found her in the library where she was reviewing notes for the salon discussion, and he stood watching her with the expression of wonder that had never faded even after 3 years of marriage and 2 children, and the comfortable familiarity that came from building a life together. And when she looked up and teased him about the 5 duels he had fought before she would consent to trust him, asking if he would do it again if circumstances required, he crossed the room and took her hands and answered with absolute seriousness that he would fight 50 duels if necessary, because she was worth every wound and every moment of uncertainty and every transformation he had undergone in learning to see what society's shallow standards had blinded him to for so long. And she kissed him then with the easy affection of deep love, and told him no more duels were necessary because she had finally learned to believe in her own worth and in his love, and in the possibility of transformation that came from choosing courage over fear. Dear listener, perhaps you too have felt yourself overlooked or dismissed by those who measure value by superficial standards. Perhaps you have heard cruel words that wounded deeply and made you question your worth. Perhaps you have struggled to believe that people can truly change, or that love can transform both those who offer it and those who receive it with trembling hope, despite justified fear. Know this: true worth lies not in meeting society's arbitrary standards of beauty or charm or conventional attractiveness, but in the qualities of mind and heart and character that endure when superficial appeal fades, in the courage to remain kind in a world that often rewards hardness, in the strength to build meaningful life even when recognition seems impossible to achieve. Like Beatrice, you may need to learn your own value through painful process of being overlooked before being finally seen, may need to choose courage over the safety of sustained bitterness, may need to risk trusting again despite past wounds that whisper warnings about the foolishness of vulnerability. And like Ashford, you may need to confront your own blindness and fight not with swords, but with daily choice to see clearly and value truly, and prove through patient action that transformation is possible when love demands growth rather than comfort. May you find the courage to recognize your own worth even when others fail to see it. May you choose vulnerability despite the terror of potential pain. May you believe in the possibility of transformation, both in yourself and in those who seek to earn your trust, and may you rest tonight in the peace that comes from knowing that true love sees completely and values entirely and fights fiercely for what matters most. Remember to subscribe to Whispered Chronicles for more stories of transformation, courage, and the remarkable journeys of overlooked souls who discovered their own extraordinary worth, and may your dreams be filled with gardens where forgiveness blooms and hearts learn to trust again despite every reasonable fear.